it's moving on.
Fantastic.
Thank you for joining us from Pittsburgh. That's fantastic. All right. Well, I think we're going to have a great conversation today, so I'm going to go ahead and get us started. I am Dr. Erica Trappel. I'm the director of the Prevention Research Center for Healthy Neighborhoods, and I want to welcome all of you to our April installment of the PRCHN Research Seminar Series. In today's seminar, Moving Beyond Symbolic Gestures, the Respectful Engagement of Underserved Communities in Research, Dr. Craig Fryer will explore key concepts in this empirical area and share a typology of community engagement representing common approaches in research. He'll also share his reflections on specific research experiences with diverse groups in which engagement invariably shaped and impacted study outcomes. I will certainly say a bit more about Dr. Fryer because I have plenty of wonderful things to say, but I just want to catch you all up on a few other things that we do as we get started with our seminar. So if you're not already familiar with us or connected with us, you can catch our website on the left-hand side, our social on the right, and we encourage and support your use of social media and the hashtag PRCHN seminar to promote Dr. Fryer's work today. We always highlight our next month's seminar. Next month in May, we are presenting Dr. Jen Kim Mozaleski, who's a faculty member here at the PRCHN, who will be presenting her work on promoting smoking cessation by addressing food insecurity in Cleveland and beyond. I believe Bree has already put the link to that registration in our chat box, so please go ahead and register today if you haven't already. Because we miss still being in an in-person setting, but recognize that so many more of us can be together in this virtual setting, we wanted to create a way that we're creating a little bit of community while we're together this afternoon. So please feel free to add your name and organization into the chat to introduce yourself to others that are joining the call, and so that you can see who else has joined us as well. And you can do that in the chat feature. And we'll also ask you to use the chat feature today to type in questions. And when we get to that point, we'll also have folks take themselves off mute so we can engage in more of a conversation as well. So now it is my true honor to introduce everyone to my good friend and colleague, Dr. Craig Fryer. Woo, I haven't had enough caffeine yet today and it's noon. So I have the official bio, but I feel like it's important for me to just share a quick personal story. Dr. Fryer and I met at the Society for Research on Nicotine and Tobacco a few years back, maybe in 14 or 15, right? And we were in a session on the intersection of marijuana and tobacco, and we were both there thinking that this was certainly going to be a conversation about blunts, and it sort of wasn't, but we caught eyes across the room. And since then, I think we've been fast friends and wonderful colleagues. And I'm just so lucky to work with him and learn from his wisdom. So let me share with you a little bit more of an official bio on Dr. Fryer. Dr. Fryer is a behavioral scientist and utilizes mixed method study designs to examine the socio-cultural and environmental contexts of health and well-being, with an emphasis on community engaged research. His scholarship focuses on racial and ethnic health inequities in substance use, specifically the intersection of tobacco and marijuana use among youth and young adult populations. Dr. Fryer's collateral research interests include Black men's mental health and coping, racism and health, and the influence of the urban environment on health. Dr. Fryer has served as principal investigator or co-investigator on a multitude of research studies related to a wide range of health behaviors and health outcomes, which have been funded by the NIH, the CDC, and the FDA. Dr. Fryer's teaching, research, and service are guided by a commitment to creating a more just and equitable society for devalued and underserved communities. He completed his undergraduate work here at Case Western Reserve University and obtained a Master of Public Health degree from the University of Pittsburgh in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. He earned his Doctor of Public Health degree from Columbia University, Mailman School of Public Health in New York City. And today, Dr. Fryer is Associate Professor and Interim Chair of the Department of Behavioral and Community Health in the School of Public Health at University of Maryland, College Park. Dr. Fryer, thank you so much, both personally and professionally, for spending time with us today. And I am very happy to pass the screen over to you.
I had muted myself. Thank you very much for that wonderful introduction, and I'm excited about being here today. Hopefully during my presentation and hopefully some time for discussion, you will find this a good use of your time. Let me share my screen and we'll get the presentation going. You all can see my screen?
Yes, we can.
See the slides well? Okay. So again, Erica, thank you kindly for the invitation. I'm excited to talk about work that we find critically important. Many of you know I'm at the University of Maryland, and we also have a PRC. Our Prevention Research Center focuses on the mental health and well-being of youth and young adults who self-identify as LGBTQ. So we're excited to do cross-collaboration as we think about the work of these universities. The director of our PRC is Dr. Brad Buckaloo. So let me get started. So a cornerstone of my work has always been thinking very critically about how we engage communities that have been poorly served, underserved, or never served. And particularly those who have some understanding of historical research abuse, and how do you consider that as we give thought to the importance of diverse and inclusive study samples in the research paradigm. Quickly, I'm going to do an overview of some key concepts. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on those at all. I want to talk with you about a typology of community engagement that we have given some thought to as it relates to my work in our Center for Health Equity. Very quickly go over some overviews of principles of CBPR, and really want to spend my time talking about reflections on research experiences I had where I believe community engagement changed the actual perspective of the work. Really critically important to the work that I do. So let me start with a few concepts, and I want to start with the definition of community engagement that I ascribe to. As you can see, this is a definition that comes from the CDC from 1997. And part of it states very clearly that community engagement is how you work collaboratively with and through groups of people. And what we mean by through is that through those social networks that already exist. In every community, however it is defined, if it's geographic or special interests or similar situations or the like, there are assets and solutions that are in those communities. We are often trained in our work that we describe communities from a deficit model. I always offer that if you believe that there's a problem in this particular community, there's a solution to that problem that also exists there. So we need to be thinking very critically from an asset-based, resource-based perspective. But it's also about how we mobilize those resources as a way to provide catalysts to us in changing policies, programs, and practices. So what you see here are two different graphs of the state of Maryland. And I always love to start out with this story because this was my introduction to the state of Maryland. So I was recruited from the University of Pittsburgh to the University of Maryland. I was part of a research team back in 2010. And when I first got here and began to do my work in the community, right, really introduce myself to the community, get a better sense of the community as it related to the state of Maryland, I came across this experience. So I will be out and about. Most of my work is with youth and young adult populations. So more than likely, I'm with a youth serving organization in some form or fashion, usually a community-based organization. And I'm talking to individuals, and general question is, where are you from, right? And what I would get is the county that people live in. So they would say, I'm from Prince George's County, I'm from Montgomery County, I'm from Anne Arundel County. And then I would ask after that, well, where in the county do you live? When I first had this experience, the first couple of times it happened, I thought, oh, people really don't want me to know where they live, where they're from, right? I'm trying to get a lay of the land. After this happened like the 10th time, what I realized was that it wasn't them, it was me. They were actually defining community as they see it in my new location, right? So Maryland is a very county-specific state, whereas I think the state of Pennsylvania is city-specific. So if you ask someone where they're from, they tend to tell you the city they're from. If you're in the city of Pittsburgh and you ask people where they're from, they tend to tell you the neighborhood that they're from, right? Location, geographic, the environment is context. But when you live in the state of Maryland or the state of Virginia or the district, you really live in the DMV. And in this larger photo is actually the diversity within the state of Maryland, right? So it borders 4 other states, Pennsylvania to its north, Delaware to the east, you have Virginia and West Virginia. But then you have the district, right? Where between Prince George's County and the District of Columbia, you can cross the street and you're in one or the other. Almost a third of the state is cut off by the Chesapeake Bay. It also has the Potomac River that runs through it. Lots of diversity in this regard. But what is really important is that you have an understanding of how people define community for themselves. That is what is important as you think about the work that you will be doing. As I've already mentioned, we should be thinking about community assets, and often we talk about those from a fiscal or financial perspective, but we should be thinking about skills within the community, power as it relates to local associations, resources, as well as both physical resources. Often a lot of the work that we need to do requires space to do so, and we can find those in the communities in which we work. So I mentioned to you that in the Center for Health Equity, we have given some thought to this typology of work. Almost 10 years ago, when community-based was utilized, began to emerge as sort of the common nomenclature around this issue. I would often be in a situation where someone would say, oh, I want you to come see our community-based project. And when I would get there, I wouldn't necessarily describe it as community-based, right? And so in the work that we do in the center, we've given this a lot of thought. It kept coming up and people wanted to know, is this really truly community-based? Is it really this? Is it really that? And we came up with a typology that we think about most often as we're trying to identify where people are, right? And so we have this continuum across cooperation all the way to full partnership, and I'll say a little bit more about that later. But we would think about cooperation and we would identify that as a community-placed initiative. So say, for example, this would be the community clinic, a new community clinic in a neighborhood. And the neighborhood is cooperative in that they're not against the clinic being there, but they had no real input in its development, its design, where it was located, what will it focus on, any of those things, right? But it's a community-placed initiative, maybe needed, but didn't necessarily have a lot of input from the community. If you use that same example for community-based, where there's more coordination, right? The community would have said, we need a clinic in our community. They probably would have some say-so around what its focus would be, potentially even where it's located, and the types of work that it would do, right? Their expectations are set, coordination along this line. If you move that same initiative and think about it from a CVPR approach, then the idea would have had to emanate from the community, and they would have been involved in every specific detail of that new clinic, including its hours, who would work there, what the interior would look like as it relates to engaging the community to actually utilize those resources. I want you to think very clearly as we move along the typology or this continuum of community engagement. All 3 of these are relevant and of equal value. Too often we like to have place value on one being better than the other. They all have relevance and value because we have to meet and work with communities where they are. All of them could have great impact given where a particular community may be. Another way of thinking about community input in the research process would be if we thought about the methods and approaches we use in research. And forgive my crude art here, but on one end of the spectrum, you have no input from the community, where on the other end, you would have a great deal, right? So if we think about some of the methods we utilize in research, for example, often our clinical research is viewed as not having much input from the community at all. As a matter of fact, community members often say, yeah, they did something, but I can't remember what it was or why they did it, right? Some of our epidemiological studies, traditionally, right, there's been some change in a lot of our traditional epi studies. But by and large, there's no one necessarily protesting that the study is occurring. But by and large, we don't see a lot of input in the utilization of those particular methods as it relates to the community. But as we move toward ethnography, our in-depth interviews, our focus groups, right, there's much more input from the community in the way in which many of those studies are done, often because the community is generating that data in a real way. Photo voice and visual voices are just additional ways in which data is collected by community members using some type of art. Photo voice, they're using cameras as a way to address or respond to a research question. Visual voices is another way of thinking about the use of arts, either painting or drawing is another way to do that. And then of course, on the final end of this spectrum, you would have CBPR, which is true partnership. Again, just laying of land as we think about ways in which the community traditionally has input into research. So just a few comments about CBPR. This is the traditional definition by Barber Israel and Meredith Minkler, who put CBPR on the map as you think about their work. At the time, they were both at the University of Michigan. What I want to just highlight here is CBPR is an approach. It's often viewed as a method, but it's an approach, a way of thinking about viewing the community as a co-learning experience and having areas of expertise that complement the expertise of the scientists. In addition to that, why would we be thinking of the utility of CBPR now? For those of us who do health inequities research, or those of us who are interested in addressing health disparities, we are asked to think about complex health issues that are often ill-suited to be directed solely by an outside expert alone. We actually need insider knowledge to be more effective in the development of our work. Increase on solutions versus just having the ability to identify inequities. We've had intervention results that have been disappointing, particularly for communities of color. Increasing demands from the community to have more collaborative efforts, to have more input, to have their voice heard. And then an additional increasing funder interest as it relates to community-driven versus community-placed research. Three key concepts of CBPR are participation from the beginning to the end, right? The idea in and of itself needs to be generated with the community as a partner. Equal power, and as we think about power, we should also think about accountability, right? So no one owns the project, if you will. And then of course, joint planning from the start. So then the question would be, well, why is it important that we engage underserved communities in the research enterprise? And I want to tell you that this is not just a conversation about the right thing to do, that there's scientific reasons in which we should ensure that we have diverse study samples in our research paradigm. So our need for participation is both multifaceted and scientifically driven as we think about increased racial and ethnic participation in our public health research paradigm. Many of you have seen this graph before. In 2005, the Pew Research Center, actually it came out in 2008, the Pew Research Center did a projection of, that was actually actual and projected percentage of the US population across the four largest groups in the US. Those who self-identify as white, Hispanic, Black, and Asian. And they looked at 1960, 2005, and 2050. And as you see the changing demographics in this projection toward 2050, you see that there will be decrease in the number of individuals who self-identify as white, great increases in those who self-identify as Hispanic, relatively same percentage for those who identify as Black, and also an important increase among those who self-identify as Asian. And so the question then becomes, do we have science that will have the ability to follow and meet our demographic changes as they occur? We can't be static in our ability to include and recruit and engage diverse study samples in research, particularly when we're talking about national designs or those that are funded primarily by the taxpayer dollar. In addition to this, many of you know the Revitalization Act that occurred, where NIH now requires you to include women and self-identified people of color in research. And if you are not, you have to justify why they are not included. This is really important. Previously, you may have a very sound scientific plan, but your inclusion plan may have been weak, but it may not have impacted your overall priority score. Now, if a reviewer thinks that your inclusion plans are not acceptable, it has to impact your priority, has to be reflected in your priority score. And so now those scores are higher, if you will, or not as good, regardless if the science is sound or not. This is really important. So in our Center for Health Equity, where I'm an associate director, we have given this a lot of thought. And so we have several publications around this issue of factors that shape participation in research. And in this particular paper that I led, we actually interviewed scientists who have been deemed to be effective in recruiting and maintaining diverse study samples in their research studies. And we were very interested in their perception of why they were effective, what made them effective, and what could we do to glean to assist other investigators who were not as effective in doing so. By and large, people want what they want in any relationship. They want the same in a research relationship, right? They want you to be trustworthy. They want transparency. They want empathy. They want humility, and they want reciprocity. Those are things that are critically important as we think about the research relationship. Too often, what we have done traditionally in research is that we have, in an effort to recruit a particular community, we wanted to have a research team member who reflected that community on our team. Race matching or racial concordance between the research team members and the actual community that you are trying to recruit. And that had been essentially the standard for many, many years. And I posed a question in these interviews of what these investigators thought about that. And by and large, although representation matters, and we're very clear about that, we understand that as we think about many of our pursuits as it relates to addressing inclusivity, it is not the primary factor by which you would have the ability to engage or why individuals would participate with you in your research. There's these other attributes and shared values that may have more impact, if you will, on your decision to do so. The other thing that I wanted to raise here as an important finding from this particular study was that the investigators were asked how their own racial and ethnic background assisted them in their ability to recruit diverse study samples. And the role of self-reflection came up often in their ability to address this question. And they talked about their motivation for doing good work, but their lived experience as it related to issues of racism and other social injustices. This is really important as we think about the whole person and not just the scientific person showing up when we talk about research engagement. So I want to share with you, I mentioned to you that I wanted to talk with you about some research experiences that I've personally had, where I believe that community engagement altered and enhanced the overall experience to a point where the science was better. And this is really important as we think about those who are interested in community engaged work. Too often, it is described as being time consuming. If you're an academician and you're on the tenure track, you often are told not to do that until you get promoted, right? You don't have time because your clock is ticking, all these different things. I've been fortunate in that it is the only way I know how to do research. It was part of my training as both a graduate student and a doctoral student at that level. And it is what I believe is the best way that we should be doing work, particularly for those of us who do health inequities research. So I want to take a moment, if you will, and bring you into my world as it relates to my work. So as Erica mentioned, most of my work is with the health and well-being of youth and young adult populations. And this particular study is a part of the work that I had. I had a KO1 by NCI. This was my favorite grant I've ever written, where it looked at correlates of adolescent nicotine dependence among urban youth. But prior to me obtaining my KO1, I had a small pilot study when I was at the University of Pittsburgh. And I want to share with you how community engagement had an impact on the ability to recruit. This particular study was an R21 funded by NIDA. And the principal investigator was also at the University of Pittsburgh, and they asked me if I would join the research team. So the grant was funded, the work had not started yet. I was asked to become a member of the research team as a co-investigator. I was a brand new assistant professor, and in all of my naivete, I said to the principal investigator, I would love to join your research team with one caveat. And that is if we could try to recruit a study sample that self-identified as at least 50% of the study sample identified as Black youth, so that we can do some true racial analyses to see if race was a factor as it related to this particular topic. The topic we were analyzing was, we were essentially deconstructing anti-smoking public service announcements. At the time, we knew public service announcements were effective, but we didn't know why. And so we were essentially deconstructing them, or having young people deconstruct them. And so we were examining different factors of anti-smoking PSAs as a way to get to the crux of what made them impactful. So this is Bill Shadle, who was at the University of Pittsburgh at the time. And I came on board to assist in this work. So I'm gonna share with you this recruitment flow chart. Bear with me, I'll walk you through it. So we had designed a traditional multimedia campaign as a way to recruit young people into the study. And that included flyers, ads that were in high school newspapers, as well as some parent distributed papers, because of course we needed parental consent. And then we had radio spots. And at the time we had a radio spot on the only Black radio station in Pittsburgh. Comprehensively, I thought that this was a very good multimedia campaign for recruitment. So we started that at month one, as you see there. And 4 months in, we were having a meeting, and Bill said to me, Craig, we have recruited, I think at the time, 27 young people into the study. But 95% of them identified as white youth. And so he asked me, remember what I had said, I had this caveat that I wanted half of our study sample to identify as Black. He said, do you have any ideas? Sometimes you have to think about what you wish for. And I said, I do. At the time, I was with the Center for Minority Health at the University of Pittsburgh. We had a community infrastructure. And part of that community infrastructure were youth serving organizations. And so I said to Bill, we need to meet with a youth serving organization and discuss with them opportunities that we may have to engage self-identified Black youth. And so we did that. Bill had never done any type of community engagement in his research career. And I took him on this journey in this process. And so we met with the executive director and the youth development director of this organization for 2.5 months before we ever talked about our research study. It was much more about getting to know the organization and what they do. To make a long story short, they wanted to partner with us in this effort. We actually hired young people from that organization to assist us in recruitment. The way this initially worked was that young people would come in for a 2-hour session 3 weeks in a row, so a total of 6 hours of exposure to the work. And they would watch videos and then fill out surveys as it related to responses to those questions. So that was occurring in those initial 4 months with young people. In this case, what we did was I asked the youth serving organization what was the day of the week where they got the majority of young people at their center. And that turned out to be a Monday from 6 to 8 p.m. So we had sessions with young people at the community center on Monday evenings, and then the follow-up day was Thursday. So if they missed that Monday, they could come on Thursday and complete the same session so they can stay in rhythm, if you will, with their cohort the next Monday and then the following Monday. Remember, 3 days a week, 2-hour sessions. But also part of that was we developed what is called the Community Enhanced campaign. So this is what I'm describing to you. It's community-based, it was peer-led, it was youth-centric, right, as a way to be more inclusive in our efforts to engage self-identified Black youth. We ran both media campaigns total, and then moved into month 9 and 10, where we went into data analysis. And then part of my feedback to those young people, we have to think of our study participants as consumers of our work. So I did teachings with young people about our study results. So our final sample, we had 133 young people, just to give you some example of our results. Almost 60% of that sample identified as a woman. And as you can see here, what I was very proud about was the fact that 55% identified as Black. That was my initial caveat, because one of my frustrations in many of the studies I had been a part of prior to this was that we couldn't truly do racial analyses to see if race was a true factor, because we didn't have enough study participants who identified across racial and ethnic groups. Most importantly, if you look at the circled cell at the bottom, we also looked at cost per participant, and the Community Enhanced campaign was actually cheaper than what we were spending through our traditional media campaign. And that meant because we were reaching more at a given time than sort of the one-on-one service that was happening with our traditional campaign. So that's one experience as it relates to how I felt community engagement really helped shape, in this regard, the work that we were doing. I want to talk with you about a second experience that brings you to a current study that I currently have as we think about Black men's mental health. Prior to the current study that I had a pilot study that was it was an administrative supplement to a P60 grant that we had in the Center for Health Equity. It was actually a P20, excuse me. And I want to talk about how this experience had an impact on our partnership with Black men in this particular area. This particular study was referred to as Toughing It Out, Understanding Mental Health Coping Strategies Among Black Men. So I was the sub-project PI on this grant. And essentially what we aimed to do was to talk to Black men about their conceptions of health and more importantly, knowledge and attitudes and beliefs around health and well-being. In the Center for Health Equity, part of our community infrastructure is what we refer to as our HAIR network. HAIR stands for Health Advocates in Reach and Research. And it is essentially a combination of 6 barbershops and 3 salons, all in Prince George's County. Our flagship shop is in Hyattsville, Maryland. Prince George's County, as you know, borders the northeast quadrant of the district. So it is very diverse. Populations who are participants are clients of the barbershops and the salons across race and ethnicity. So individuals who self-identify as Black or Hispanic or a combination of the two. We did 40 in-depth interviews using the life course perspective actually in the shop. The actual photo that you see there is a interview space that we built out in our flagship shop. That's a screening that's taking place in that particular photo, but that is the actual same space where we actually conducted the interviews. And we were very interested in emotional well-being as part of their conception of what is health and well-being. Our interviewers were also Black male doctoral students who were in a program, a doctoral program in the Department of Family Science, where they were licensed. At the time, they were already licensed therapists. We wanted to be very sensitive to issues of trauma that may come up, and wanted to make sure that we had the ability to be able to identify, but also refer individuals to resources if necessary. The title of this presentation was Toughen It Out. It was a concept that this group of Black men kept using as it related to how they cope and endure with any particular factor that may have impacted their health and well-being. Out of this work came these themes of resiliency, right? Social support was critically important. Spirituality was identified as an important factor, but also manhood. Often manhood or masculinity is described in negative ways. For example, toxic masculinity. But many of these men describe manhood, the ability to man up, if you will, as something positive, right? And something that they wanted to, they believed occurred as you matured as a man. What is also interesting about this work, many of these men defined their best health. We asked them this question about when were they in the best health? And to the person, it was always when they were younger than 21 years of age. Often they reference high school, often associated with their ability to play a sport at a very high level. But the other thing I would like to point out is their definition of their best health often was at an age where they weren't necessarily fully responsible for their health, right? To give some indication that someone else, parent or guardian, or someone else may have been paying particular attention to their health and well-being. And then mental health wellness emerged as a pressing need for Black men through these interviews. So this was initial, as I did, was an admin supplement to a larger P20 center grant that we had. And from this work, our barbers said, we want to do more. And one of the things that's very interesting is you think about barbershops and salons as non-clinical therapeutic spaces, right? There's a lot of things where that location, that space is much more trustworthy than a clinical setting. Our barbers, what you see here are some photos from an innovation design studio meeting that we had with barbershop owners and their clients. There's also scientists in at this particular conference and also funders of research. This particular title, No Research on Us Without Us, came from the barbers and stylists, where they wanted to have the opportunity to engage with other academicians and funders around the issue of research very broadly. So we took them through an innovation design studio as a way to think very critically about the role that barbershops and beauty salons can play in this work. This was based off of previous work that we've had through our hair network. Remember, many of these members are part of the hair network. This was December 2019, so this is all pre-COVID. And there were individual interviews that were done. There were focus groups that are also done that were part of our conference, but it was all part of this innovation design studio. From this work, we got to hear from barbers about what they believe is the role of the barbershop. I will share with you all that this photo is actually my barber. Yes, I go to the barbershop even though I don't have a lot of hair anymore. This is the other caption here is a photo from a local magazine called Community Care, and it says the doctor is in, and they're referring to barbers as being the doctor. Our barber was very proud to be in that magazine and on the cover. But here the premise was they don't want research to happen on them. They want research to happen with them, and they don't want it to happen without their voice being considered and part of that work. Here you see some selected responses to some of the questions that they were posed on barriers to participation, and then reflecting on uncomfortable experience they had with someone not being comfortable being in the shop in and of itself. But I would like to draw your attention to the quote that comes on this one particular photo. Stephen Thomas is the director of our Center for Health Equity, but one of the things that we have learned through our experience is that this quote here, a doctor can write a prescription, but what happens when people get home and talk with opinion leaders in their community? And that would include barbers and stylists. They may not have a PhD or an MD, but they have trust that conveys credibility that health professionals themselves don't have. And so hopefully what I hope you see is the evolution of the partnership, if you will, that we are experiencing with our hair network. Our current next steps as it relates to our commitment and dedication to a longstanding relationship. We want to assist barbers and stylists to become certified community health workers. I know many people are doing this work. As a matter of fact, we already have. I'm proud to say that last year, we now have 5 barbers and stylists who have become certified community health workers and are now employees of the University of Maryland. We're also very interested through the work with our barbers to think of setting research ethics standards for those who want to do work in these spaces. And this, of course, comes from our barbers wanting a better understanding of research ethics, but also what to expect and what they should not expect as it relates to sound research. And then also to establish a National Association of Barbers and Stylists for Health. This is another idea that are coming from our barbers and stylists in this regard. So common key points about process that I just want to go over very quickly. Things that emanate through my experience doing community engaged work. Transparency is critically important, not only about the project and the goals, but about our limitations and our time constraints. I'm very clear up front, particularly working with young people around this issue. The ability to create ownership in a project, and also the flip side of that, which is accountability, they go hand in hand. Many people have community advisory boards that are associated with projects. As a center, we have a community advisory board regardless of a particular project. So they are a cornerstone of the center, and they actually review proposals and provide both oral and written feedback to principal investigators. Principal investigators have to be the person that comes and provides those oral presentations, and they get specific feedback from our group. That's just one example of how you may create ownership given where you are and who you are working with. A big one for me is as academicians, we love methods and approaches, but you can't assume that your community partners understand or care about them. It's really important that in this co-learning experience that you think very critically about where people are and what will best work. And then always in the acknowledgement and the value of the community. It is the precipice on which I sit. I don't do work. I can't do my work without them in that regard. And I believe that to be critically important as we think about reflecting the assets and both resources and seeing them as a co-expert in what we are trying to learn and to do to assist communities regarding their health. And then finally, as we think about community engaged, both research and practice, thinking about how it can enhance community capacity. I'll always think about what a great mentor of mine told me something long ago, that you actually work yourself out of a job. My role is to increase independency when I'm working with communities, not dependency. True partnership is not dependent, right? You work together in that regard. Establishing sustainability. This is the huge question that we always get about sustainability over time. And it's something that we have to have in the forefront and you have to plan for as it relates to longstanding partnerships. And something that's very important to us, we actually wrote a paper about this, to accelerate the translation of research findings. We have tried and true processes that are important to the research process. But in the meantime of those taking time, if you think of a traditional R1 grant that's 5 years long, and then learning about what you have learned from those, or the process of effectiveness and efficacy as we think about intervention work, those take a long time. And there are some communities that are suffering all that time. We have to think about how we accelerate translation as a way to assist those communities, but also those things that we can do right away to help alleviate suffering in that regard. And then the final thing I'll say, and hopefully we can have some discussion in the next few minutes, is around this issue of resources. So another different grant that we've had in our Center for Health Equity was a National Bioethics Research Infrastructure Initiative. There were 5 aims to that particular study. I will never write a study with 5 aims ever again. But 2 of those aims were around the development of curricula. And we have developed curricula. One is about for investigators and how they can become a self-reflective researcher, so successfully engaging communities of color. And then we also have a curricula for community members as it relates to becoming enhancing their decision-making around becoming a study participant or a human subject in research. So we're not vested in them saying yes, we're vested in them having an understanding of what they should look for their decision to say yes or no. And I will ultimately say there are some studies that people should not participate in if they have questions or concern about how they will be treated. And with that, are there any questions? I'll be quiet.
Dr. Fryer, thank you so much. I would encourage folks to turn their cameras back on and either give a little thumbs up or a show of appreciation for Dr. Fryer. I'm giving you a quiet round of applause over here. And just thank you so much. We do have some questions coming in. As we both shared, I think it's a very great opportunity to have a good discussion. So I hope people will add questions or raise your hand if you'd like to come off mute to ask your question in person. The first question comes from Claudia Craig Byers. Claudia, would you like to come off of mute and ask your questions directly?
Yes. Dr. Fryer.
Yes.
How do you assure privacy when you consider participatory research, in that you want honesty from those people who are responding in order to have accurate background and information?
Yeah.
And sometimes they know, in communities, they know private stuff, which impacts some of the issues, for instance. But how do you assure then that your collection is going to be the collection of this information is going to be kept confidential, and that the publications of the research results, because
Yes.
one of the things we don't do very well in the community research is tell people what we found.
Yeah.
And so how do we assure them that the privacy issues will be somehow protected?
It's a fantastic question. So first of all, let me say privacy, anonymity, and confidentiality are critically important in this work. We do a host of different things as it relates to privacy. So number one, given our work, given what the work is, right? So if we're talking about what we would consider general conversation around issues of screening for chronic disease, for example, right? That may be quite different than if someone is sharing a traumatic experience that they believe has impacted their mental health. So we do a lot of work around the relationship building. So number one, we never require, and this is very interesting. I'm gonna take this I'm gonna take my response to another place with you in a second. So we have trainings with our barbers and our stylists around privacy, confidentiality, and anonymity, number one. But they actually practice that every day because they are, for many people, they are counselors, right? If you think about that, right? Their individual interaction with their clientele is their personal relationship with those individuals. But once we are engaged with them in a research process, we all have to abide by privacy and anonymity in that regard. So we don't collect personal data like names and the like, unless there is an opportunity potentially if we need to refer them for resources, right? But we actually keep those records separate from the actual data in and of itself. Really important in that regard, so that people are not, their unique identifier is not connected to their name only on a particular sheet that only the PI has access to. Even our students that we work with, and those don't have necessarily those connections. But I think the other thing that you're alluding to is when you're working within a community where essentially everybody feels as if they know everybody. And this is really important because sometimes as an outsider, you have the ability to engage only because you're an outsider. People would not share certain things because they feel like you are too close, right, to their personal life and their perspective. It is something that we ethically are always thinking about and always having conversation about, particularly as it relates to the space, if you will, of a barbershop and a beauty salon. Fantastic question. In our publications, our work is, by and large, we report work in the aggregate. However, if we're using a qualitative method, particularly, let's say a quote or the like, we do what everyone else tend to do traditionally, pseudonyms. We try not to use any, I believe in attribution, right? You need to give attribution to a person's quote because it's data, but we try not to use any identifiers where they can be pinpointed in that regard. The other thing that we do, or at least I do, particularly with youth and young adults, is I do member checks as a way for me to gauge if what I believe I'm doing as it relates to privacy and anonymity is actually effective. So I get young people's perspective on the way in which that is brought back in and what we do, right? So one of the reasons why this is interesting, we publish manuscripts for our own communities, right? For other academicians and the like. But you can't assume that a community member doesn't want the paper. They may not have access to it, but that doesn't mean they don't want it. Many have asked for it, but others want the information in a very different way. They find the reading of many of us find the reading of a scientific article boring, right? So I've used all types of ways to share information back, teach-ins, town halls, whatever it may be. And in those spaces, anonymity and privacy are critically important because you never want to share something in a public space about someone regarding information that they have shared through a research study. Great question.
There was a question early on about folks having access. So I just want to remind everyone that we are recording, and this recorded session will be made available through our YouTube channel, which can be accessed through our PRCHN website. And it should be up within the next 24 to 48 hours for anyone who'd like to go back and revisit Dr. Fryer's presentation. Dr. Fryer, there are also a couple of questions about some of the papers that you referenced in your presentation. And I wonder if you might be able to share those references, and what we can do is add them in the comments of your recorded presentation for folks who'd like to go back and look at those more closely.
Sure. Would you like me just to send you the links and you can include it?
Yeah.
Will do.
Thank you.
The list that I showed on the slide, I'll send those links.
Wonderful. Dr. Craig Byers, I know you had a second question on the chat. Did you want to ask that one as well?
Well, I think Dr. Fryer included that question in his answer to the first one, and I appreciate that very much. Thank you.
So, Erica, this is Peter. How are you doing?
Great. How are you?
I'm good. So I do have a question to my good friend there. And it's a little, you know, you talk about CBPR and talk about respecting community and the notion of being engaged. My question is, as you continue to do your work, where's the intersectionality happening between mobilization and participatory engaged research, particularly when we think about the climate of where we are and so much activism happening? So I'm just curious about what you're hearing and what's happening in that space.
It's a fantastic question. And so I told you I value transparency. So in all full transparency, you all may know Peter Witt. This is my best friend and my frat brother. So of course he had to ask a question.
Absolutely.
Great question.
wouldn't be right.
So it's a really important question. So when we think about mobilization, particularly as it relates to research, often we think about what you have probably heard as participatory action research or action research more broadly, where the aim of the study is not to find a result. The aim of the study is to take that result and then utilize it toward a particular issue. Mobilization, one example of mobilization would have been that design studio. It's a different type of mobilization, and I'll share with you why. Through our relationship with Black men, through our Barber Shop and beauty salon initiative, the stylists and the barbers came back to us and said, you have educated us a lot and we now want to do something. And part of the do something, we said, well, what do you want to do, right? We have done, we have offered a lot of things. I'll give you a very quick example. At one point, our barbers and stylists said, we would love to learn CPR. And we said, okay, great. So we lined up these trainings on CPR. And then when they realized, wait a minute, I got to make a decision if I'm going to conduct CPR on a person to save a person, right? They didn't want the legal nor the other ramifications, right? So that wasn't the type of mobilization that they want. So what we did is said, okay, let's think about what you actually would like to do. What is it that you want to be a part of? Part of this movement was, as they thought about research engagement with academicians as one example, was that they wanted to have the ability to talk to them now about much more broadly what they believe is the importance of the industry that they're in. One of the quotes said, I believe we have the best industry ever. Barbershops stay around regardless of finances. They probably have some of the most diverse clientele ever of any organization, and they move in that regard. Our mobilization now is to try to put our barbers and stylists in the forefront. So they have asked to be certified community health workers. They have asked for this national organization. You know what they also want to do? They want to have annual conferences. They said, we want to do what y'all do. You all gather and have annual conferences. They want to hear what other barbers are doing around health initiatives with other academic centers nationwide. They want to acknowledge those, right? So one of the things we did at the design studio, this is what they wanted to do, is they wanted to give awards for stylists and shops that have been around for a certain number of years, right? So one that's been in existence for 25 years in operation or 30 years in operation, those are things that they want to do. They are the empowerment that is happening around them driving what is their next steps. We haven't seen, right? We've never seen this level of engagement around them saying, okay, these are the next steps. I'm in the shop every week. Every week I'm getting an update on, hey, how do you think we can do such and such? So one of the things is they're thinking about, if you think about first aid, they're thinking about being mental health first aid identified, right? They want to have the ability to identify if they think someone needs potentially to think about talking to someone for services. And so part of our role is to think about what would those resources be, and then what training would they need just to have the conversation, right? Because they don't necessarily want to be, nor do they have the time to be trained as a therapist. But I think mobilization is really important. The final thing I'll say is another experience I had working with youth around this issue of tobacco control. In that initial study that I talked about, that group of young people that we hired to help do recruitment gathered around this issue of no tobacco in our community, in our environment. They were responding to disproportionate tobacco advertising and availability in their community. They formed a group and then became part of the national organization around these issues. So mobilization around community, particularly youth voices, is really important to me. And if I may get on my soapbox real quick, for those of you who have engaged in, develop, work with community advisory boards, I just want to encourage you to ensure that you have youth representation on your community advisory boards. If you don't have youth representation on your community advisory board, you have an adult community advisory board. Young people's perspectives are too often ignored and unaddressed, and you want to ensure that this is the challenge that I put forth for our Center for Health Equity, and in any other group, I always iterate this. And I would offer that in our case, we bring young people, we double the number of young people who are invited. So that they're not the only one, right? Because you can think about levels of intimidation and the like that they may feel in that regard. But mobilization is where we are. I don't think we are no longer the traditional, here are our results and we move on. Communities are saying, no, I need much more. If you want me to partner with you, then I need to see some immediate and long-term benefit from being your partner.
Thank you for the answer.
Thank you, brother, for the question.
Craig, I have a question for you. I was excited to see the desire for a national network of barbers and stylists that emerged. And instead of dipping my toe, I think I've jumped into the deep end of establishing barber relationships here in Cleveland fairly recently. And just this past Monday, had the real pleasure of finally being back out in the community, hanging out in a shop for a couple of hours, sharing a meal, doing all those things that we've missed doing over the last couple of years. And one of our barbers said something similar, like, we've got to get this out. We've got to get this across the country. So I'm wondering, where, I'll ask a two-part question. Where is that in development right now? And is there an effort to kind of reach across? And is your group, or is the thought that this needs to be a standalone, or should it be integrated into sort of the other national barber network that exists?
Fantastic question. Yes, so twofold, where are we at? So at that design innovation session that we had, we invited, I don't know if you know the work of Laura Lenan, she's out of North Carolina, longtime partner with us, those of us who work in the Center for Health Equity. So we invited her to come and share the work that she's conducting in North Carolina. We see this as clearly reaching across as we think about national conference, if you will, and that's clearly what our barbers want, right? They have, they felt that they have benefited greatly from learning more about what's happening in Maryland and in the district, but they want to know what is happening nationwide. I also think that they think very critically about the collective voice and the power that is part of that, right? So they're very interested in that sort of national conversation for barbers and stylists. Separate versus being integrated is a very good question, because that was our first thought, right? So when you go to think about how organizations are nationally aligned, we were like, oh, I already thought that this existed. I can tell you, but what I believe where they're at is that they feel like that for Black salons and shops, there are unique challenges, both with their clientele and from the business perspective, that they think are not getting addressed from the existing national organizations. They just don't feel like, when they are part of the larger group, that their specific or unique issues rise to the level of priority. So I think initially they were thinking just for those who self-identify as Black-owned or Latino-owned. I will say this, our most of the barbershops in our hair network are unisex and cross-cultural. So it's very interesting. When I'm talking to my self-identified Hispanic brethren in the shop, they were like, this is a Hispanic shop. And when you talk to my Black brethren who the same shop, they'll say, no, this is a Black barber shop. That to me speaks to how cross-culturally, right, it doesn't matter in that regard. And that is reflected in the music that you hear at any given time of day. It's reflected in how the barbers self-identify, how the clients self-identify. I think that's really important. And that speaks to something that may need to rise to a national conversation. But we definitely want to reach out. There's no way any one entity can do this work alone, particularly if you're talking about building of a national organization. We are thinking about how do we seek support for that. And primarily we've been in conversation with foundations about that work. Does that help, Erica?
Absolutely.
You need to reach out. Is that what you're saying? Reach out to you?
I need to, well, I've been saying I need to talk to you for a couple of weeks. I just haven't made it happen. So don't worry, I know how to find you. And I want to make sure to give more time to others because they might not know how to find you as well as I do. There is a question from Sherry Bolin. It says, how have you handled which groups you partner with around research? Hi, Sherry, I'm glad you came on. And do you want to add anything else to that?
Yeah, I would just say, I think that this kind of work tends to, like all collaborative and engaged work, takes time, meeting, understanding what people want, how we could work together to have a greater impact. All of those things take a lot of time and effort. And I'm struck, especially as we're thinking about our CTSC work here in the region and how we support researchers who have many different populations that they work with, but how we engage with them and have community engage with them and partner on their work. I don't know if you've come across that within your center, which populations are you spending more time with, which groups, and how you ended up having some of that conversation maybe initially around partnerships.
That's a great question. So I always start from the perspective of who's not at the table. So let me share this. I'll give you a quick example. Our Community Advisory Board is actually called the Community Research Advisory Board, or CRAB for short. That's their name. And their logo is the Maryland Crab. That is how they identify and wanted to be identified. We initially met with a group of service providers talking about us getting a better understanding of our new location. And they began to discussed this issue of, oh, we should develop a community advisory board. And we said, okay, if that's what you, and how do you think that should go about? And what we kept asking is who's missing, who's not at the table. So we just had a series of meetings where we kept talking about the importance of research, collaborating with our center, if at all possible. There were no guarantees, there were no anything, but much more about who is it that we should know. And, but the other thing is we didn't want it all to be representation from just service providers, right? We actually wanted what you would consider to be the traditional layperson in the community that would have the opportunity to share their voice. And of course, for me, that also included youth and young adults. And so given a particular project or idea that came from that group, we have extensions. So we have a core advisory board, and then given a particular topic or issue, we invite others, right? Because that representation may not be at the board in and of itself. We give a lot of thought to history in the community, particularly when you're the new person, right? So what is the history behind that? We ask for that level of transparency. You know, you get things where someone may be suggested and then recommended and another person shakes their head no. We want to know what that's about, right? So what is that about? Particularly when you are the new person and wanting to be inclusive, but also want to be sensitive to the entire process. But that does take time. Now, one of the things I will say, as often academicians are thinking about their own careers, right? I offer that community engagement should be prioritized at a level where if someone is a new, meaning they're just coming to an institution to work, they shouldn't have to do it all by themselves. There should be institutional supports just like there is for anything else, right? So if your work involves the use of labs, right, you expect your institution to support those labs. If your work involves community engagement, you would expect that there's some type of infrastructure that you can then walk into, right? Not you walk in and there's clearly work you have to do as an individual, but you should not have to be developing those new relationships with the university as the institution trying to get your work done. There's a way in which we can facilitate community engagement and the institution can support that. An institution, I mean the university or your school or your department, right? Or your collaboration with a center that already has. And so we get a lot of those inquiries. We've done a tremendous amount of work through the HAIR network, but we have other parts of our community infrastructure other than the HAIR network. But you do have to pay particular attention if you are being as inclusive as you believe you are, and when that should occur versus other times, right? We also, our community research advisory board members are paid for their meetings. And of course they are fed, right? It's one of the ways in which we want to think about the time that they are giving to the work that benefits us all. And we also then ensure that they have the opportunity to talk about the work of their own agency or where they are and how the group can support all of that work. But it's a really important question to think about as we think about who is partnering and who may not be at the table and why. Thank you. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Muted. We are at 1:15. And I want to respect Dr. Fryer's time, but I'm so grateful for Dr. Fryer's presentation and for everyone who's joined us today for this wonderful presentation and discussion. Thanks again, Dr. Fryer, for your presentation.
Thank you.
For the audience, as I mentioned, it will be available on our website, prchn.org, in a very short period of time. I'm looking at Bree, and I'm sure she's probably getting that ready for all of us. And again, we invite you to join us next month with our May seminar presented by our very own Dr. Jen Kim Mozaleski. And everyone, I hope you enjoy your day. Thanks again.
Nice meeting you all. Thank you. Thank you for your time.